Chapter 1, what is psychology? Psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processing. So that means in psychology we apply science, specifically the scientific method, to studying human behavior, animal behavior, and also mental processing. So essentially how we think. Because psychology is a science, we say that psychology is empirical. When we say that something is empirical, we mean that you can observe it. You can gather evidence by observation, by watching what's going on. You can design experiments to test your ideas, to test the presence of something. And you can also measure it. So if you've ever taken a survey, for example, maybe a survey on career options, you have engaged in empirical study in psychology. Psychology has a lot of historical roots, many influences that help to explain how psychology got to where it is today. As a discipline, psychology is relatively new. It's only been around as a formal discipline for about the last 200 years. But there are several historical roots that help to explain why psychology exists the way that it does currently. One of these historical roots is something called phrenology, and you see here a graphic of the human mind that's essentially mapped and divided into different areas. So you see here, this is the part of your brain that deals with cautiousness according to phrenologists. This is the part that deals with hope, firmness, spirituality, ideality. Phrenologists essentially believed that they could tell you about your personality based on the bumps that are on your skull. So they would feel a person's head, right? Maybe this person in the picture here. Feel a person's head, and from there be able to determine, based on the bumps on your head, if you were going to be a criminal or if you were a virtuous person, a non-deviant, a non-criminal. And so this represents a first attempt to try to explain personality, albeit a crude attempt, right? We might liken it to some kind of criminal profiling, but today we have much more sophisticated methods for that. Okay, so let's talk about modern psychology. Where did it come from? What are the other historical underpinnings? So in the late 1800s, the first psychology lab is established in Germany, headed by Wilhelm Wundt. And Wundt created this technique that he called introspection. And with introspection, you carefully observe, you analyze, and you describe your own experience. The goal of introspection is to break down behavior into its most basic elements. You can think of it as the way that a chemist would try to break down a compound, a chemical compound, into its most basic elements. So if we wanted to take the chemical compound of water and break it down to its most basic elements, we would break it into hydrogen and oxygen. So introspection had similar goals, breaking down an experience into its most basic elements. So in addition to Wilhelm Wundt's ideas of introspection, psychology also has a few other historical underpinnings. Three early branches include Structuralism, Functionalism, and Psychoanalysis, and we'll talk about each one of these now in greater detail. So first, structuralism. Essentially, these are people who followed Wilhelm Wundt's ideas of introspection, and they renamed it. They took his technique and developed it into a school of thought that they called structuralism. And so structuralism then has very similar goals to introspection, right? It uses that technique of introspection, where again, we're trying to break down that experience into very, very basic elements. We want to know what happens when an organism does something. What is going on? What is your experience? So, for example, I might ask you to break down all of the different components of taste when you're biting into an orange. So some of you might say, oh, this tastes very sweet, it's very juicy, it's very tart. So as you can see, different people would describe their experience very differently, right? Different people will focus on different things. So sometimes that would produce conflicting reports, right? So that was one of the problems with structuralism. We're asking different people to describe their experiences, and different people emphasize different things in their experience. Another problem with the early structuralists, we're finding out all of this information about your experience. I want you to break it down into its most basic elements for me. But then, what do I do? What do you do with this information? So what? You just told me how an orange tastes to you. Big deal. Now what? What do I do with this? So based on the problems that individuals saw with structuralism, they then created a new school of thought, something they called functionalism. And we'll see this as we go through the history of psychology, that oftentimes a group of people come forward with a particular idea, with a particular way to explain behavior, to explain the way that people think. And they'll, of course, believe that they have the most correct explanation for those things. And another group of people will say, no, I disagree. I don't think that that is the way that we can best explain behavior. Let's take my approach instead. So that's essentially what happened with the functionalists. They had problems with the way that structuralists were trying to explain human behavior. So the functionalists then came up with this new school of thought that they built on structuralism. And functionalism is championed by a man named William James, very famous historical figure in American psychology. And functionalism then is based on trying to understand how something happened, the function of behavior, the purpose of behavior, instead of just a description of the behavior like the structuralists were providing. We want to know how something happens. We want to know the process. We want to know why something happens, as opposed to just what happens, as the structuralists. Instead of simply describing the basic elements of an experience or of some kind of process, they wanted to see how these basic elements allow that organism to adapt and to survive. So you can see that this is built on the work of Charles Darwin, who looked at the process of adaptation within animal species and how adapting to the environment enables different species to survive, to continue with reproduction. Functionalists then help to broaden the field of psychology to make it a more applied science, and functionalists broaden the field to open up study to many of the areas that we focus on today, including study with children, animals, religious experience, stream of consciousness. Psychoanalysis, another one of our historical roots in modern psychology. And psychoanalysis we largely attribute to Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was a Viennese medical doctor who came up with his own type of therapy called psychoanalysis. Essentially, if we take the word apart, psycho comes from the Greek for psyche, the mind, and analysis. So in analysis, analyzing the mind. Freud's particular form of psychotherapy emphasizes the unconscious. So Freud believed that we are motivated by drives like sex and aggression. And these two drives of sex and aggression influence all of our behavior. They essentially explain why we do the things that we do. But the problem is that these drives of sex and aggression are unconscious. They are operating below your level of awareness, motivating your behaviors, but you don't realize that they are in fact motivating your behaviors. Freud also believed that we have internal conflict. Again, at an unconscious level, you're not aware that these conflicts are influencing your behavior. But we're constantly in conflict with different parts of ourselves. We have our desires, right? Things that we want to do, perhaps things that we pursue because they feel good, because it makes us feel good. But then we also have the demands of the larger society. So we can't just go out and only do fun things all of the time because you have some kind of responsibilities as well. So Freud believed that that conflict between what we want to do, what we want to pursue, motivated by our unconscious drives, and what society tells us is appropriate behavior for someone of your age and status, that creates constant turmoil that's going on beneath the surface. Okay, so those psychoanalysis, structuralism, and functionalism then represent our historical underpinnings. These theoretical perspectives, biological, learning, cognitive, cross-cultural or sociocultural, psychodynamic, and positive psychology, represent different theories that we use in modern psychology. Each one of these emphasizes a slightly different approach to explaining and understanding human behavior and mental processing. So each of these focuses on different things as important in helping us to understand why people behave the way that they do. So you can think of these different perspectives essentially as a lens, as a perspective, as a way to view behavior. Okay, so our biological perspective then, they made it really easy for you. It tells you exactly what it focuses on, your biology essentially. So we're looking at how internal processes, physical events, things related to your physiology, things related to genetics, affect your behavior, your feelings, your thinking. So we can look at things like hormones and how hormones might affect your behavior. So, for example, when you go through puberty, right, one of the things that signals the start of puberty is the production of hormones, specifically sex hormones. We might also look at brain chemistry, the release of brain chemicals called neurotransmitters, and how those brain chemicals are related to your mood, for example. Heredity. Are there things that run in your family? For example, does your family have a history of depression? And we'll also talk about evolution and how evolution might be helpful in explaining some of the behaviors that we see currently. A learning perspective focuses on the environment and experience. So how the environment either rewards behavior or punishes behavior, and how that relates to maintaining a certain kind of behavior or discouraging specific behavior. With a learning perspective then, we can focus on two subfields that fall under this broad learning perspective. We can look at behaviorism, where we study only observable behavior. If I can't see it, it is not happening. So behaviorists then stand in stark contrast to psychoanalysis, right? And Freud's perspective that focuses on the unconscious. The unconscious, that's difficult to see, right? You can't touch it. You can't see it. It's going to be very difficult for you to measure that. And so the behaviorists took real issue with that particular approach and said, no, we need to focus only on observable behavior, what we can actually see happening. And that is what is important in helping to understand why people do the things that they do. A social cognitive approach looks at not only observable behavior, but combines it also with things that are not so easy to observe. Things like your thoughts, things like your values, your expectations, your intentions. So people learn not only by adapting behavior to the environment, but also by imitating other people and by thinking about the events that are happening around them. Right, so a cognitive perspective. Whenever we talk about cognitive perspective this semester, cognitive always refers to thinking. So cognition is thinking. So a cognitive perspective then looks at mental processing, looks at how you think, essentially related to perception. So how you take in information using your five senses and make sense of it. How do you organize it? How do you perceive what's going on around you? We might look at how your thinking relates to things like memory, and we'll talk about that later on in the semester, language, and problem solving as well. So cognition always emphasizes thinking. A cross-cultural perspective or socio-cultural perspective looks at outside forces, specifically social forces. So social forces, this is basically people who are around you. Anytime you are in a group of people, you might do things that you wouldn't necessarily do if you were by yourself. Cultural forces, additionally, can be very important in helping to explain behavior. So you might be very loyal to your cultural background. Maybe you were reared in a very traditional, conservative, religious household, and so you have very traditional expectations for gender roles, what's appropriate for men and what's appropriate for women. So your culture then will likely influence your behavior, perhaps in terms of the careers that you pick, the institutions that you involve yourself with, like the church, marriage, for example. So the cross-cultural perspective then looks at those outside forces of social influences and cultural influences to help explain human behavior. Okay, so then we have our psychodynamic perspective, and a psychodynamic perspective emphasizes the unconscious, okay? So a psychodynamic perspective is drawn from Freud's form of therapy, psychoanalysis, okay? So the psychodynamic perspective you can think of as the broad umbrella term, and then psychoanalysis would fall under a psychodynamic perspective. So with the psychodynamic perspective, we're looking at the unconscious again, those unconscious drives, those unconscious motivators, that internal conflict that's going on, that you're constantly trying to reconcile what you want to do with what society tells you is acceptable. But again, you're not aware that these conflicts are going on. They're happening unconsciously. So this perspective then not only involves the unconscious, but also involves early experience and really emphasizes the importance of things that happen to you very, very early in your life. So, for example, Freud believed that your entire adult personality was developed by the age of 6. So all of the experiences that you have from birth until age 6 are the only things that are important in determining how you will turn out as an adult. You have had all of the experiences that you need to have to determine your adult personality by the age of 6. So in psychology then, we would call that a very deterministic perspective, meaning that early experiences determine how you will turn out. There isn't so much emphasis in a psychodynamic approach on your ability to deal with those circumstances, deal with those early experiences, and make a conscious decision to perhaps change your personality. So that takes us then to a humanistic or existential psychology perspective. And so this particular approach emphasizes your personal growth, your ability to become the fullest, best, most high-achieving person that you can possibly be, to achieve and reach your full human potential. So humanistic psychology then developed as a reaction to, they rejected behaviorism. They rejected this idea that only behaviors that can be observed are important in explaining why we do the things that we do. And they also rejected psychoanalysis or psychodynamic approach that says early experience determines what you will become. The humanists believed that early experience is important. So for example, you may have something very traumatic happen to you as a young child. Maybe one of your parents died. That experience undoubtedly would be important in determining, who you turn out to be. However, that experience does not completely determine who you turn out to be. It's still up to you. You still have free will, personal responsibility to determine who you will become. It's ultimately up to you to determine what you want to do, how you want to deal with those early experiences, and how you will let them or not let them influence who you are as an adult. Positive psychology then, another force in psychology today, relatively new, gained force in the 1990s. And positive psychology, people who champion this approach believe that on the whole, psychology has focused on the bad things about being human. We have adopted primarily a medical model where we focus on disease, we focus on pathology, we focus on what's wrong with people. And so positive psychologists said, why don't we change the discussion here from what's wrong with people to perhaps what's right with people? What are the positive things? What are the good things about being human? They study things like happiness, optimism in thinking, life satisfaction, life fulfillment. So really focusing on the things that contribute to allowing humans to flourish as opposed to focusing on what's wrong with people. Okay, so those theoretical perspectives then we will apply throughout the semester. We're going to talk now about settings where you might see psychologists working. So psychologists then can work in a number of different settings. They can have different specializations. There are academic and research psychologists, so these are people who work in university settings, or they might work in research laboratories, maybe working for the National Institute of Mental Health, National Science Foundation, or they might be conducting research at a university. So examples of people who would consider themselves academic or research psychologists, we have experimental psychologists. Experimental psychologists are interested in studying things like learning, motivation, emotion, sensation and perception, and cognition. So they're essentially designing experiments to test out these different areas in psychology. Educational psychologists study how psychological principles relate specifically to learning. Okay, so learning. And they apply this knowledge then to search for ways to improve our educational systems. Developmental psychologists study how people change and grow over the lifespan. So they might study things like how people change physically, how people change mentally, how people change socially. Some specialize in different parts of the lifespan, maybe looking at childhood issues. Others might study adolescence, young adulthood, middle years, or even old age. Industrial organizational psychologists study behavior in the workplace. They're concerned with things like group decision making, employee morale, work motivation, productivity, job stress, marketing strategies, and other issues that specifically relate to productivity in the workplace. And then we have psychometric psychologists. Psychometric psychologists design and evaluate tests of mental abilities, aptitudes, interests, and personality. So if you've ever taken an intelligence test, for example, or a personality test, a psychometric psychologist likely designed the questions that you were asked or the tasks that you were asked to do. So there are people who practice psychology also. I think usually when you tell someone, oh, I'm a psychologist, they automatically assume that you're a therapist, that you do talk therapy. But not everyone is. As we just saw, there are psychologists who work in academic and research settings, but there are also psychologists who practice psychology. So there are different kinds of psychologists who practice psychology. We can talk about counseling psychologists who help people deal with everyday problems. So let's say that you just started at a university, you're having a really difficult time adjusting to being away from home, to having a roommate, to the new expectations of college. A counseling psychologist could help you with that. A school psychologist, they work directly with teachers, with students, with parents to help enhance student performance. So let's say that you're a teacher, you have a student in your class who you suspect might have some kind of learning disability. You would consult with a school psychologist to figure out the best way to aid the student in learning. Clinical psychologists work with basically the gamut, the entire range of emotional and behavioral problems. So whereas counseling psychologists work with people on adjustment issues, on everyday problems, a clinical psychologist can also work with people on adjustment problems, but might also work with people on more severe problems, so things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, personality disorders, things that we'll definitely get into later on in the semester. So clinical psychologists versus psychiatrists. I think this is a distinction that you should definitely know and that a lot of people mix up. So what's the difference then between the two? So clinical psychologists and psychiatrists both get training in diagnosis, in treatment, prevention, causes of psychological disorders. However, their training is different. So clinical psychologists receive a doctoral degree. So this is a professional degree in psychology, either a PhD, which is a Doctor of Philosophy, or a PsyD, which is a Doctor of Psychology degree. Okay, so they get professional degree training in psychology exclusively. Psychiatrists, however, receive a medical degree. So they go to medical school. They either get an MD or a DO. These are medical degrees. And then while they're in medical school, they specialize in treatment of psychological disorders, okay? One other difference between the two, traditionally psychiatrists, because of their medical training, have been the ones who were allowed to prescribe medications. So let's say that you're depressed, you want an antidepressant medication, you would go see a psychiatrist to get that prescription. However, in two states, in New Mexico and in Louisiana, as it stands currently, clinical psychologists, as long as they receive 2 years of additional training above and beyond their professional degrees in psychology, they are allowed to prescribe medication also. And this change is largely due to a shortage of clinical psychologists, a shortage of psychiatrists in these particular areas. So giving prescription privileges to clinical psychologists helps to alleviate that shortage. Okay, so these are the specialty areas as they exist within psychology. You can see that about half of people who are psychologists practice. They're psychological practitioners, so they're either in clinical or counseling psychology, and then by and large the other half of the specialty areas here, they would be considered academic or research psychologists. So you can see that there are many areas that you could potentially go into in psychology.